Hi folks, this is Scott with SimpleSpider.com. Today we'll be installing Oracle Linux 7 on Oracle VirtualBox. You can see here I've already got my VirtualBox Manager started up. I'm going to go ahead and click New. I'm going to type in a name for this instance. I'm going to call this my base because I'll copy this several times after I've created it to do different types of installations. You'll see as I started to type my name, it already decided based on the name that I typed that it was going to be the type of Linux and that it was going to be an Oracle 64-bit install. I've named it Oracle OEL, so I've named it OEL, Oracle Linux, Enterprise Linux 7, 64-bit base. And I'll go ahead and say next. It's going to ask me how many megs of memory do I want to use. It's defaulted to 512, which is enough to run this instance. But I'm going to go ahead, because I have plenty of memory on the system, I'm going to go ahead and set this to 4 gigs. This will also, by default, allocate my swap to be 4 gigs also, which is what I want. I want to have enough swap and I want to have enough memory to run all my instances, whether I'm running a database or an application server. I can add file system swap later, but by default I'd like to have 4 gigs of memory for the most common instances that I'm going to be running, and I'm going to have that 4 gigs of swap as well. I'm going to go ahead and click next here. It's going to say, do I want to add a virtual hard drive? I do want to have my OS installed on a virtual hard drive, so I'm going to go ahead and say create a virtual hard drive now, and I'm going to click create. It's going to say, what do I want? Oracle VirtualBox allows me to have many different types of disk images. I'm going to go ahead and choose the default of VirtualBox disk image and click next. It's going to say, do I want to have it fixed size so it's automatically allocated, or do I want to have it dynamically allocated? The fixed size will give me a little bit of a performance increase because right now it'll allocate all the disk for me. The dynamic will allow me not to use the disk until I actually need it. I'm going to choose dynamic and say next. It's going to say, where do I want the file systems located, and this is fine for me where I've got them located. And it's also going to ask me how much space do I want to allocate for the root file system. And here I'm going to change it to 50 gigs. Again, it's dynamically allocated, so I don't really have too much of a concern. I'm not going to install anything on this root system other than the base OS file system. I'm going to create additional LUNs unless it's a very small application that I'm installing here. So I'm going to go ahead and set it to 50 gigs, and I'm going to say create. This is going to automatically create my instance for me. And so I'm going to right click on this instance and choose settings. And here I've got my general options, more advanced configurations here than the basic configurations that it asked me for here when I was creating the instance initially. The name is still fine. Most of these configurations are going to be exactly what I want. But I'm going to go ahead and click settings or system and choose processors. Now by default it said 1 CPU, and it said because my system has 8 CPUs, I can go up to 8 CPUs. I'm going to choose to set this to 2 CPU, and here I'm going to go down, and also my display is fine. I'm going to also modify my storage devices. It's automatically added the CD DVD drive that I have, but I don't have any of my software on CD or DVDs, so I'm going to go ahead and remove this drive. And I'm going to add the ISO drive that I've already downloaded. So here I've got my Oracle Linux 7 64-bit. I'm going to go ahead and choose that device. And finally, I'm going to make one other modification. I'm going to come down here to network, and by default it's set to NAT, which should be fine for all of your systems. But I'm going to switch this to Bridge, so it's on the same network as everything else that I've got. I've got a DHCP server running, and this should act as if it goes out to the network and everything for me instantly. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK to this, and now I'm ready to start this instance and start this actual installation. And it's going to pop up and ask me, what do I want to do? Do I want to test the media? Do I want to start the installation? I'm just going to go ahead and say, let's start the install. I've already tested the media. I know the media works correctly. It's going to go ahead and do a file system check. I don't need to do the file system check at this point in time, so I'm going to hit the escape button. Alright, the first screen that pops up is the welcome screen. It asks me what language do I want to work in. English is the correct language for me. So I'm going to go ahead and click continue. It's going to ask me, it's going to have by default configured several of the items for me. The date and time is configured correctly for my time zone. The keyboard is configured correctly. The language support is correct. The software where it's coming from is the local media device. The minimal install is always what I want to choose for a Linux install. I never want to choose anything but the minimal install. I can always install additional packages down the road specific for what I need rather than installing everything and having security issues and size issues and everything else that comes along with installing too much. So I'll do a minimal install. It's asking me how do I want to partition the disk, and this one's got the exclamation point here. So I'm going to go ahead and go into this and check it. It's asking me to verify that it's how I want it, and yes, this is the device I've created. And it says, do I want to automatically partition? And yes, it's already configured. So I'm just going to go ahead and say this is what I want and say done. Here I'm going to choose my networking. I don't have to go in here and configure this, but I'm going to go ahead and configure it now. I'm going to turn it on so I automatically get an IP address. I'm also going to go ahead and give this a name, OEL7x64 base.simplespider.com, which is just my domain name, and I'm going to go ahead and say done. And then I'm going to go ahead and begin the install. We'll see right away it starts installing. This is different than how it worked in 6. In 6 it walked me through every single screen before I could start the installation. Here in 7 it has all the screens kind of bundled up into one, and I have to click on them on that first screen that we were looking at, and I have to click on them to choose which things I want to configure differently than the default configuration. I'm going to go ahead and set a root password at this time, and I'm going to set a strong password since this is my administrative password. And once I've set that strong password, I'm going to say done. It also at this time allows me to create additional users. For me, I'm not going to create additional users here, which means I'm going to have to sign in with a root account initially. I'll script my additional users down the road so that I can just automatically do a post installation, create all the users who would be administrators, or create accounts that I have, monitoring accounts and things like this that I have in a scripted format, and not individually create them and have them randomly do passwords or set up their SSH and configurations like this. So I'm going to leave this alone right now, but this will mean that when I first sign in, I'm going to have to sign in under the root password, or the root account, which is something that you don't want to normally do. You don't want to normally go in there and sign in as your root account. We'll see that I'm about past two-thirds of the way done, that about 278 of the 325 packages are already installed. Once this completes that all the packages are installed for this minimal install, there'll be a couple other steps that it'll go through, but there won't be anything else that I need to do other than reboot once it's complete. So we can see it's already in the post-install installation steps right now. And Oracle is, along with CentOS, both have freely available patch sets. They do have a licensing that you can purchase for support. There's 3 different tiers currently. They have a ULN tier, a basic tier, and a premier tier. The ULN tier just gets you a couple additional Oracle libraries. Of course, their default web support, and you fall under their license agreement on the software, so there's some benefit there, that if the software is found to be in a lawsuit, that you actually fall under their software license. Whereas if you're not using their software license, then you really don't have any legal ramifications if somebody comes after you that some of the software, the open source software, isn't freely available. Their basic runs right around $3.99, I think, right now, maybe $4.99, and it allows you their web support, that you can actually have a support person that you can actually talk to with them. And their Premier gives you a couple advanced features. Their Unbreakable Linux is a nice advanced feature. This is okay, so now it shows that it's complete, and it says here's where the end user license is available at for you to read it. and it asks you, do you want to reboot? And we'll reboot it this time. Since this is a minimal install, it should come up rather quickly, and the disk I'm running on is pretty fast. It shows that I've got 2 different versions, or actually 3 different versions. I've got a base version, the Enterprise Linux version, and the Rescue Disk version image all available for me to boot up to. It automatically booted up to the Enterprise Linux. Now, as I said, I only created the root account, so I'm going to have to sign in as root and enter my root password. And now I can just quickly check, did my network settings come up? This is probably the only thing that's critical to me. And I can also do yum list to make sure my yum repository is configured and ready to go. And there we can see that my yum is working correctly and that I don't need to do my subscription based. So that's all that we need to do for this initial install. Thanks for watching.